I hope you can hear me. We're going to start the panel because we're late already. I'm delighted to be here and to be moderating this panel on a very challenging and interesting topic, the impact of enlargement, have we poked the bear? When formulating the question that way, it's in a way to ask, are we guilty? Are we the West guilty again? I mean, the question of guilt is a fascinating topic in international affairs, and actually the Russians like the question of guilt, and throughout their history have been asking themselves, who is guilty and what should we do? I mean, Lenin asked the question, Gertsen asked the question in the 19th century, and the Russians have been recurrently asking it again and actually accusing the West of being guilty of the current situation, for having pushing eastward and pushing NATO to the borders of what they think is their zone of interest, of vital interest. So that's the question we're gonna talk about now, and we are actually raising this question on a particularly tense moment, as Damon has mentioned before, of growing confrontation with Russia in the eastern part of Europe after an annexation of Crimea, you know, a war going on on the eastern part of Ukraine. So very, very tricky and dangerous situation. To talk about this quite extraordinary situation, difficult issues, we have three extraordinary guests. We have the Minister of Defense of Georgia, Tinatin Kidashvili. Thank you for being here. Who has been a very forceful defender of democratic processes in Georgia, and you participate in the Revolution of the Rose. And interestingly, you became a member of the Republican Party of Georgia, and actually distanced yourself from the Saakashvili team over the years. But nonetheless, you have exactly the same position on the question of enlargement. And it seems that Georgia is absolutely desperate, as we've seen, to get out of the cul-de-sac, as we say in French, you know, the sort of dead end, geopolitical dead end, where it is now at the moment after, you know, seeing tanks rolling over in 2008 into your beautiful country. And I was actually there as a journalist when it occurred. We also have Professor Mai Scheimer, who is a very renowned political scientist, and has challenged in a very forceful way what Mr. Obama calls the Washington interventionist playbook in foreign policy. You are a representative of the realist school, and you have formulated this the concept of offensive realism that you're going to explain right now, to tell us, as you did in 2014 in Foreign Affairs, that actually the West is guilty for what has happened in Ukraine and is guilty for the annexation of Crimea. So very interesting theory that we're going to discuss. And our third guest is Stefan Birgun. Welcome too. And your point of view is also extremely, I think, valuable today, because you are a practitioner of foreign policy, not an observer. You have followed actually the whole story of enlargement policies in Congress as a national security advisor on different teams, and then in the White House from 2001 to 2003, and again in the Senate. So you're going to be a very valuable voice in this debate. So I would like to start it maybe from. I know that Minister of Defense Kidashvili is going to have to leave at 1:15 because she has an important meeting in town. So we're going to try to hurry. But I'm nevertheless going to start from Professor Mai Scheimer, because you are the one who is thinking that we have poked the bear very much and too much, and we are responsible for what is happening now in this confrontation with Russia. Could you explain to us why we are guilty?
Let me just start off by saying what I think the conventional wisdom is and why I think that's wrong, and then briefly explain why I think we are principally responsible for causing the crisis over Ukraine. The conventional wisdom, of course, is that Putin, and more generally Russia, caused this crisis. I would note that there is virtually no evidence before February 22nd, 2014, when the crisis started, that the Russians were thinking about taking Crimea or aggressing to their west. Second, there's no evidence that they were moving military forces westward over time to accomplish that task. And third, and most importantly, there's no evidence that we in the West thought that Russia was going to take Crimea, precipitate a crisis over Ukraine. We were caught completely by surprise. And the reason that we were caught completely by surprise was the Russians had no intention of taking Crimea or causing trouble in Ukraine before February 22nd, 2014. Now, what exactly is going on here? In my opinion, the Russians have long been deeply concerned about NATO expansion. And we were able to get away with the 1999 expansion, and we were able to get away with the 2004 expansion, in large part because Russia was very weak at the time, and it was far enough away from Russia, with the exception of the Baltic states, which are all small, that the Russians swallowed hard, but ultimately accepted. But the April 2008 decision, where we said at the end of the Bucharest summit that NATO would eventually include both Georgia and Ukraine, was, in my opinion, a step too far. The Russians made that perfectly clear at the time. And in my opinion, it's no accident that you had the war involving Georgia and Russia in August 2008, after the April 2008 Bucharest summit. And with regard to Ukraine, the Russians have made it perfectly clear that the idea that Ukraine is going to become a Western bulwark on their doorstep is simply unthinkable. And they will wreck Ukraine before they let that happen. And of course, this is what's happening now. You might not like it, you might not like the way the Russians think, but that is the way they think. And how the Russians think is what matters here. And by the way, how the Russians think is no different than how the United States thinks. We have something called the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine basically says we own the Western Hemisphere, and no distant great power is allowed to move military forces into the Western Hemisphere or form a military alliance with any countries in this hemisphere that's directed at us. Some of you in the audience are old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. We went ballistic when the Soviets put missiles in Cuba. Who did they think they were to move into our neighborhood? And then the Soviets thought about building a naval base at Cienfuegos in Cuba. We told them that was a non-starter. If 20 years from now the Chinese formed a military alliance with Canada and Mexico, do you think we would just say, that's fine? Canada and Mexico have a right to invite whoever they want into the Western Hemisphere? I can guarantee you that would not be our response. The Monroe Doctrine is alive and well.
So the comparison, though, is very strange. I know that the Russians are using it all the time, but you're not invading Canada, I think, the U.S. That's quite a difference. You know, there's no threat to the security of your neighbors, and that's what is happening in Europe with the Russians, isn't it?
No, the point is that the Russians view Ukraine and Georgia as vital strategic interests. And the idea that a military alliance that was their mortal foe for 45 years can continue to march forward and forward right up to their doorsteps is a no-no in their mind. And they're going to do everything they can to prevent it from happening. And what I'm saying to you is if it was the United States that was in their position, the United States would do exactly the same thing. It's what the Monroe Doctrine is all about. This is the way great powers behave. I'm actually quite surprised that people don't understand this. This is geopolitics 101. If you continue to expand NATO eastward, you're going to enrage the Russians. And these guys are tough customers. There's no question about it. They know how to play hardball. And furthermore, people should remember, they have thousands of nuclear weapons. And it's very dangerous, in my humble opinion, to take a stick and poke a country in the eye that has thousands of nuclear weapons. You do not want to make them scared. You do not want to make them fearful. And I think that further NATO expansion will do that. And it will not redound to the benefit of the people of Georgia or the people of Ukraine. I think that these policies are basically leading the Ukrainians and the Georgians down the primrose path, because on one hand, we're provoking the Russians, causing all sorts of problems, giving them incentives to do damage in Georgia and in Ukraine, and the idea that the West is going to come to their rescue, you believe much too much in the United States.
I think, I mean, you're raising extremely important questions, and we will come back to the question of Georgia and Ukraine in a minute. But I would like to first, address the question of, was it a mistake, actually a foolish mistake, that to enlarge NATO in Eastern Europe and to the Baltic countries? This is a very important point because, as we know, given the current situation and what is happening, I covered the independence of the Baltic countries, and if the Baltic countries were not in NATO at the moment, they would be in real big trouble. So maybe it was a huge success that we actually have created a deterrent for these countries. So I would like to have Stefan Birgun and also you, please, not on the question of Georgia, address this issue of was it a good thing that we enlarged while it was possible to enlarge, when Russia was allowing it?
Thank you, Lori, and it's a pleasure to be here with the other panelists. It's been over a decade since I was involved in the day-to-day and the public policy debate, so I literally had to go down in my basement this week and open boxes of old files to refresh myself on the debate that we had in the 1990s. Certainly the broad contours of it are still relevant to this day, but we were having a debate in the mid-1990s that's very similar to the one that we're having today. And I believe today's discussion is specifically in the context of Montenegro joining the alliance as the latest entry in an open door strategy, but also I think Lori foreshadows some of the debate that we may want to have here about Ukraine and Georgia as well. But let me start with going back to the first principles of NATO enlargement, which we undertook, we the United States undertook in the 1990s. And it was a policy that certainly wasn't without its critics here in the United States as well as abroad and as well as in Russia. But in this case, we also have a track record of history upon which to judge some of the expectations of why NATO enlargement was viewed at that time as a constructive step for U.S. national security interests and also for the stability of Europe. I think first we have to remember, in a historical context, that two world wars in the preceding century didn't start in Russia. They started in the center of Europe. They started in disputes among European empires and among European peoples that ultimately drew the United States into major conflagrations on the European continent. Also, Russia, of course, was very much a participant in those wars. But they didn't start in Russia. They actually started in Central and Eastern Europe. When we looked at the question of how to modernize and continue to keep effective the NATO alliance, which undoubtedly during the context of the Cold War was a tremendous success in defending the security and peace of the people of Europe, a decision was made, in fact, to continue to push the alliance based upon its already existing charter to open further to new members who are qualified and able to contribute to the peace and stability of Europe. Russia was a consideration in this, and it still is a consideration in this, but Russia wasn't the central consideration in this, and I think that's simply a historical misrepresentation to suggest otherwise. First and foremost, the ideal was based upon constructing a Europe that was whole and free by engaging with countries who were interested in pursuing democratic government, market-based economies that were going to be interested in integrating with their neighbors and globally, economically and diplomatically and through trade and investment, and also to bring security and peace to Central and Eastern Europe. It was to reward democratic reforms in those moves towards international engagement with deeper integration into the institutions of both NATO and the European Union. It was intended to lock Central and Eastern European states into a structure that regularizes cooperative engagement with neighbors, and do not underestimate the tensions that simmered in the center of Europe in the 1990s after the collapse of communism. The border areas of Slovakia, Hungary and Romania, the former Yugoslavia, which completely destructed. These issues were not inconsequential to the future stability and security of Europe, and are exactly the kind of situations that, left unaddressed, explode into larger conflicts, just like we've seen in Ukraine today, because Ukraine itself was left unsecured and unstable by both its neighbors as well as by its own leaders. It invites the kind of interaction that leads to world wars if countries are left on the outside. We also extended security in a manner that gave confidence to those who would be partners of Central and Eastern European countries. We gave confidence to investors who were going to be a key driver of the development of these economies that we've seen with such enormous success across Central and Eastern Europe over the course of the last 15 years. And it also gave confidence to the governments of those countries so that they didn't have to build intimidating militaries to defend their borders and defend their rights and defend irredentist ethnic sentiments that existed in many of these countries at the end of the communist era in 1989 and 1990. And finally, it expanded the most effective military alliance in the history of the world. It gave additional resources. It balanced the burden, imperfectly, yes, but still balanced. It led to a group of countries willing to collaborate together on peace and security and on the challenges that face the security of the entire European continent. There were reasons that we enlarged NATO, and those reasons have been demonstrably successful in the last 15 years.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me here and for the warm welcome. To respond to your question, I would start with a question, actually, because I think that this discussion and lots of discussions actually on this issue are too much Russia concentrated, or too much Russia centered, or too much coming out of what is it Russia wants, what is it Russia is afraid of, what is it we should be afraid of because Russia gets provoked, and so on and so forth. And I think this is where it gets fundamentally wrong. Because as long as we are going to live in a world dominated by what is it Russia wants or what are the Russia's interests, we are going to be in trouble. And if we base our policies, and that's the question actually, since when do we base our policies? Since when the United States tailors its national security strategy as to what it is that pleases Russia? Why did you support it, or why did you do whatever you did at that time, 25 years ago, for breaking up of the Soviet Union? Was it necessarily something that Russia was happy about? Was it something that was not provoking Russia? Or do we believe that exactly like we say now, well, some of us, fortunately not many of us, that 2008 Bucharest summit decision was a mistake, or it went too far, or it provoked Russia unnecessarily? I believe that the same school believes that it was wrong to break up the Soviet Union because it was so much easier to deal with one big, whatever, ambiguous, but still one problem, one trouble, rather than in 15 troubles separately. And this is really dangerous thinking, because this goes against everything we believe in, we talk about. We say that it's real politics. I don't believe that murdering the people is a real politics. And the things should be constructed in a way as to, it's okay if there are, Anna Honko was talking here about the stories from Ukraine. I can tell you obviously exactly the same stories from Georgia. And I don't believe that it's real politics to say that it was wrong to give a right to choose to those countries. I don't believe that it's real politics when we say that, well, we are saying in Georgia and they are saying in Ukraine that we are dying with European Union and NATO flags in our hands for years now. Because we believe in it and because that's the choice we've made, and we are not let anybody, including the United States, not just Russia, but anybody, to alter that decision and to make us to change that decision. There was lots of talk about the polls, and my Montenegrin colleague was asked about it. What difference does it make? We can jungle with the numbers as much as we want, but does it make any difference? There have been polls for 20 years in Georgia about NATO membership, about Euro-Atlantic integration. There was no single case for these 20 years when less than 80% of the people said yes to NATO membership and yes to European integration. Does it make any difference? Did it make any difference for Georgia? Does anybody care just because Georgian people have made that choice? We need to speed up the process and we need to be responding to the needs of the people if we criticize Montenegro today? I don't think so. I don't think it matters. It matters as long as it supports our argument. But once it's on the other side of the story, then we don't care about the polls. And it goes the same way on most of the issues that we might touch upon here today in this discussion. But forget about the NATO. Let's go even broader, because it is not only about the NATO what upsets Russia. It's not only NATO's enlargement or NATO's attempts to build in Georgia joint training centers or facilities or to support Ukraine. It goes the scene is much wider and the problems are much bigger. Energy security. There is so much talked in Europe today. Diversity in energy security. I think this is something that upsets Russia even more than some 3.5 million people in the Caucasus joining NATO. Yes. And actually, most of the reasons for troubles in Georgia are not because of the decisions made up in Bucharest or any other summit of NATO for that matter, but this is exactly because of location of Georgia on that energy diversity route that is making Russia out of the picture in some cases. And that is making Europe able to not depend on Russia entirely and 100% when it comes to its vital interests of energy security. Because of that, shall we say yes to Russia? Because Russia will be happy and pleased and will be making probably less troubles if you just go back to business as usual and tie up all your energy security issues with Russia. If you cut the deal with Russians and forget about the rest of the world, which is out there giving the possibility to Europe not to depend too much on anybody's goodwill out there in Kremlin. I think, and I'll finish here on this, I think that the major problem or major mistake, a philosophical mistake actually, we are making here is that we base our policies on fear. And I hate to see the world that constructs its policy as to the level of how much it is afraid of Russia using 17th century technology or 19th century tools of invading the countries. And this is, as long as it will be guiding us, as long as fear of Russia getting us into war will guide us, nothing good is going to happen to this world. The world was most successful only at times when there were bold decisions made, when there was courage shown, when there were leaders out there ready to make those decisions. I remember the most significant day for the Georgia's independence story of these 25 years, when President Clinton and President of my country have raised champagne glasses in Istanbul celebrating the first pipeline project through Georgia. That's what made the difference in that part of the world. This is where Georgia really, truly became independent and free state. And that was the starter. But I believe that that leadership will be back and we will have more to celebrate in Istanbul or in any other city for that matter in the future.
I mean, you are raising, I think, the fundamental question for the West. You know, are we ready to fight for Georgia and for Ukraine? And the question is not so clear. And you know, as someone who's followed, you know, on the ground for many years, you know, the independence of Georgia, Ukraine, the Baltic countries, Poland, etc., I am all with you, and my heart is screaming when I saw, you know, the tanks rolling in, when I saw what happened with Crimea, what I saw what happened in Donbass. But at the same time, as an observer and a journalist, I can't help asking the very tough question, and the very tough question is, Russia has managed to start two wars, one in 2008, the other one in 2014, on the question of Ukraine and Georgia. So is the West at this moment ready to go for a direct confrontation with Russia if necessary? I think that it was President Obama's team during the crisis in eastern Ukraine, when the debate on delivery of weapons was in full, very, very, very strong, who said there is a problem asymmetry of interest. On the one hand, you have the Russians, and the Russians consider basically that Ukraine is theirs, and that Georgia is theirs. And I think in the end, the basic question is that they haven't yet accepted the independence of these two countries fully, right? And on the other hand, you have the West absolutely nervous and trying to stabilize the Europe and seeing, that they should play a part. But let's say it bluntly, the Obama administration refused to take the risk of getting involved in a direct confrontation with Russia. So what are we to do now? I'm asking the question to Mr. Professor Mearsheimer. Can you say something about that? And Stephen, please, can you say something as well?
Well, I think that we proved conclusively in 2008, in August of 2008, that we would not fight and die for Georgia. And I think we proved decisively, in my opinion, in the spring and summer of 2014, that we would not fight and die for Ukraine. What's going on here is you have a situation, as Laura said, where for Russia, Ukraine and Georgia are vital strategic interests. They're willing to fight and die there, which is hardly surprising given that it's on their border. But the United States is not. This raises the question, why are we even thinking about NATO expansion and giving Article 5 guarantees to two countries that we've already made it clear we won't defend militarily? It just doesn't seem to make sense. And it's not just, Ukraine and Georgia. If you look at the polls regarding public opinion polls regarding how the Germans think about fighting to defend, not Ukraine and Georgia, but Poland and the Baltics, 57% of Germans say they're not willing to fight for Poland or for the Baltics. That's in a recent Bertelsmann poll, and in a Pew poll from last year, majorities in both France and Italy said they did not think it was worth fighting for Poland or the Baltics. And on top of all this, Britain, which has had military forces on the European continent since June 6, 1944, is going to pull all of its ground forces and air forces out of continental Europe by 2019. So here we are talking about a growing threat in Russia, right, expanding NATO eastward, and what direction are the British going in? They're going in the other direction. The Germans basically want to roll over and play dead. And the Americans have already shown quite clearly that they won't fight for either Georgia or Ukraine. What's going on here?
So should we just give up and just respond to the blackmail of the Russians? Because what you are actually in a way saying is that they have drawn already their line. And we are in a very complicated situation, because what are the drivers of U.S. Russian foreign policy? I think you say in your article of 2014 that the drivers of Russian foreign policy are their security interests, their legitimate security interests. But isn't it just a form of blackmail? Isn't Russia actually intimidating us into thinking that it's gonna go mad when it's not? This is really a question. I'm asking myself this question, and Stefan, what do you think?
Well, this is not a new debate. Actually, the same question was asked in 1997, would we go to Poland's defense? And I'd hazard to guess if in 1938 you asked that same question to a room full of people like this, the answer would be no. Would we come to Poland's defense if Hitler's Germany invaded them or the Soviet Union? The answer would have probably been no. And that was the beginning of World War II. I think there's an equal argument to be made in the aftermath of the Bucharest summit that reinforcing the notion of a security vacuum in Georgia and Ukraine actually created exactly the vulnerability that made military action plausible on the part of the Russian Federation. And in listening to Professor Mearsheimer's account of the Bucharest summit, he may be the only person I've ever met who sees the headline coming out of that summit that Georgia and Ukraine are on the way to NATO.
The Russians too.
And Vladimir Putin, when in fact the singular headline outcome of that summit was Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy ending the effort to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO for at least a generation. And so there was no basis that was driving Russia to a point of extremis in relation to either Georgia or Ukraine related to its NATO membership. Now, Russia has its interests, and that's all that counts. That's a really tough one for me to swallow. Russia has its interests, absolutely, but we get an opinion and a voice, too, on assessing those interests. We don't have to be intimidated, Laurie. We have to make our own assessment and evaluate, in our view, the legitimacy of those interests from our perspective. We are also entitled to our own interests in the world.
Yeah, but for instance, if you had been in the White House when the Crimea crisis started, and
right.
when the operation of the Little Green Man started in eastern Ukraine, you are at the NSC at this moment. Do you advise, as for instance, Edvard Luttwak told me when I asked him, I said, what would you do, Edvard Luttwak, to protect Ukraine and to make sure that this thing is not going to go out of hand and the Russians get this blackmail, this kind of card to take Ukraine hostage? He said, it's very simple. We have to make a decision where you draw the line of deterrence. If we bring now a division of NATO troops to Ukraine on the demand of the government, we make a statement to the Russians. But it wasn't done.
Yeah, so
it didn't happen.
Yeah, what I would say is, I certainly would not have advocated going to war with Russia over the invasion, over the annexation of Crimea or the invasion of eastern Ukraine. But the steps that need to be taken in order to prevent such situations from happening precede the invasion. They don't follow it. We could have, in hindsight, done a lot better with Russia. I think our policies with Russia and how we engaged Russia certainly is worthy of some critique over the past decade, over the past 15 years. I also think our engagement with Ukraine, we have to reflect on the steps we took and to the degree to which in proceeding with an open debate about potential for NATO membership and ultimately ending that debate, at least for a period at the Bucharest summit, also created a security vacuum, which I think invited these kind of steps. And so, with the benefit of hindsight, there are things we should have done differently and should have done better that may have helped us preclude the situation. But once the Russian forces are standing in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea, the options are far more limited. Absolutely. We're not going to go to war over that, and we shouldn't.
I want to go back. I want to go to the question of the West weakness that you have raised, and Damon has actually raised also in his preliminary remarks, because this is absolutely a key question. I'm from France, right? And when you see what's going on in France at the moment, it's absolutely bewildering. I mean, we have a huge segment of the French population, because of the question of radical Islam, which is ready to fall into Putin's lap strategically. You have, Marine Le Pen's party, which is not now an insignificant party, whose foreign policy, program is to get out of NATO and strike a military alliance with Russia. So it's a very frightening scenario, and you have, similar processes which are at work. So, what is happening when the core of NATO is in trouble and is actually in existential questioning? what can we do about the enlargement? And I think I want to ask this question to Tinatin. Tinatin, do you feel that in Europe, and also in the US actually with the Trump phenomenon, that actually the situation is getting really desperate for your cause, for Georgia?
Well, it's very difficult for me to speculate with the public opinions in other countries. I cannot do it even about my own country's public opinion if the polls are not very recent and if the elections were not conducted just yesterday. It's quite difficult. At the same time, I believe that there are issues when you do not go necessarily on the first morning for the public opinion. I just wanted to respond with exactly the same example as it was already said, the Hitler before Second World War, if there were public opinion polls. I believe that we all know what would have been the outcomes of it. On the other hand, when we say that, for example, a big majority of French are not ready to go and fight and die for Poland or any other country for that matter, obviously, if the question was about Georgia, probably the response would have been even worse. I always have this problem with, I've said it already before, with using this kind of narratives, because how many of those French know that Georgia was the only country, or the first country, who went on the very first call of the French government when they went to fight and die in Central Africa? How many of those French asked the question about whether they're ready to go for partnership or for whatever cause with Georgia know that? How many of them really were ready to go fight and die in Central Africa for the same reason? But French government has decided to do it anyways. And both in Central Africa and Mali, Georgia was the first country who went there, contributed its troops, and went in for the whole mission. And you say that the terrorism is #1 threat for most of the countries out there in Europe. Absolutely so. How many of those people in Europe know actually that Georgia is the #1 per capita troops contributor in Afghanistan? Exactly fighting these things that most of the Europeans believe are of an existential threat to their existence. These are the issues that need to be addressed when we ask those kinds of questions. Otherwise, most of the people probably can't even find Georgia on map. But if you know what is it that Georgia does, then this is where the politicians are making decisions. Politicians are elected to lead their countries for the time that they are elected for, and not to be led on every single issue. Otherwise, we would have had direct democracy, people making decisions on everything. Why do we need parliaments? Why do we need governments? Why do we need presidents? At all, we can call the people on the town hall meetings every day and make decisions together with them and by them every time. We check it every 4 years or 5 years or whatever electoral cycles we have. This is what current democracy is all about.
No, I mean,
but again,
I totally agree with you, and I must say, for fairness to our government, that despite the fact that it is incredibly unpopular at the moment, the French government has I think about 15% support in the population. They have stuck to their commitment in terms of the sanctions regime, for instance, in a very strong way. They have rejected the idea of selling the Mistral, which had been a deal struck by Sarkozy. I mean, they've done quite a few steps, but they can go as far as they can because they are pressured by the public opinion. So what I'm trying to say is that Georgia and Ukraine, it's also a sort of friendly warning that they should not nourish illusions. There is also the question of survival for countries like Georgia or Ukraine. And I remember, like Yulia Tymoshenko, who maybe not the model for for all kind of behavior, but Yulia Tymoshenko, when she was in government and the war in Georgia occurred in 2008, took a very cautious position on the question of NATO, of the relation of Russia, as if by some kind of instinct, because she's a very shrewd politician, she was feeling the danger was huge. And actually, Professor Scheimer, when you said that in 2000, nobody could have ever thought in the West that before 2014, Russia would be interested in invading Crimea, I think this is wrong, because I remember covering this issue, and that at the very moment when we were covering the Georgian war in 2008, the Russians were distributing passports in Crimea, and there was a lot of talk, in intellectual circles, nationalist circles in Moscow about this very question of Crimea. So it's not. This is not a surprise. I mean, the process of Russia going back to the bullying tactics that they've had for centuries, let's say, is not a new thing. And personally, one of the things I want to ask you is, what is the drivers of Russian foreign policy? This is a very important question, because my experience of covering Russia for 20 years is that the drivers of foreign policy is inside. And it's the change. I think you are also someone who says that there is no link between the type of regime that you have inside and the behavior of a country. And I believe in the Russian case it is wrong, because Russia's departure from the democratic experiment, the failure of the democratic experiment of Russia, has led precisely to Russia going back to the logic of control inside and outside, and logic of control of the former bloc.
A couple points. I do think that domestic politics or regime change, to use your language, does not matter much. I would not say it doesn't matter at all, but it does not matter much. And I would say in terms of how the United States and Russia behave on the world stage, the United States is much more aggressive than the Russians are. We're much more heavily into blackmail than the Russians are. I would remind you that the United States has fought 7 wars since the Cold War ended. We have been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since the Cold War ended. We toppled the regime in Afghanistan. We toppled the regime in Iraq. We toppled the regime in Libya. And we tried to topple the regime in Syria. The amount of murder and mayhem that we've created in the Middle East is actually quite staggering, right? This is one of the reasons the Russians are so fearful of us. So the idea that, the United States is different than Russia, I don't know about that. This is what great powers do. This was my basic starting point. Great powers are very dangerous. They're paranoid about their security. That's what principally drives them, not exclusively, but it's what principally drives them. And if I lived in Georgia or I lived in Ukraine, I would be very nervous. There's no question about it. I fully understand why someone from Georgia, like the Minister of Defense, wants to be part of NATO. It makes perfect sense. But the point I would make is that your interest as a Georgian or as a Ukrainian is very different than the interests of the French and the British, and it's certainly very different than the interests of the United States of America. You want to understand, we are a huge country. We have abundant security, despite all the threat inflation that you find here in Washington. The United States is the most secure great power in the history of the world. We're separated from Europe and Asia by 2 giant moats. We have thousands of nuclear weapons. We live in a unipolar world, which means by definition we're the only great power on the planet. It just doesn't get any better than this, ladies and gentlemen. So the idea that we're going to go to war against a nuclear-armed Russia to defend you or to defend the Ukrainians is not going to happen. And I think you want to be very careful not to place too much faith in the United States, because as I said before, the United States talks a good game, but they're basically leading you down the primrose path, and you're going to get yourself in real trouble because you live next door to the Russians, and they are nasty.
Can you respond very briefly, and maybe very briefly, because we'd like to take 1 or 2 questions for the audience?
I do think we need to reflect on this notion that might makes right, and that Russia's interests are Russia's solely to define. We watched in the former Yugoslavia some of the most brutal bloodshed since World War II. Concentration camps, mass executions of civilians, brutalization of the populations of the country. Russia saw it as its interests. If you want to define Russia's interests as what Russia's interests are, Russia's interest was for the Bosnian Serb regime. Russia's interest was for former dictator Slobodan Milosevic to continue and succeed in their aims. That was the expression of Russian interest that we heard from Moscow at that time. any legitimization of that interest I find completely repulsive. This was one of the most violent and darkest eras in European history since World War II, and this was one of NATO's finest moments in fighting one of those 7 wars that John just pointed out we were engaged in since the end of the Cold War. Russia's interests do not extend to Central and Eastern Europe by any stretch of imagination. Soviet interests extended to the Warsaw Pact. But if we really wanted to listen for the voices of the imperial powers opposing the expansion of NATO to the Czech Republic and Hungary, then we should have gone to Vienna, because it had nothing to do with Moscow, nothing whatsoever. These are not even historically Russian territories, or Soviet territories, or Russian imperial territories. I mean, this notion is farcical. NATO is not a threat to Russia. Since its founding moment in 1949, Norway has been a member of NATO on the border of Russia. And here we are, 70 years later, still waiting for that invasion by the Norwegians into Russia, pointed like a dagger at the heart of the Russian Empire. Come on, the expansion of NATO has created stable, peaceful, friendly states in Central and Eastern Europe that have contributed to the net security of Russia as much as it has to anybody else in the European continent.
Can I respond really briefly? I think that what is where I find the biggest problem in your logic is that you get Russia absolutely wrong. Because if you believe that, okay, forget about Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, and all those gray zone countries for that matter. But if you really believe that now giving up officially, openly, publicly on Georgia will stop Russia there at the Caucasus Mountains, this is where exactly you get Russia wrong. Russians are going to knock doors here in the United States if they believe that they have a game with you. If they believe that they can stop you, they can blackmail you, they can make sure that you are driving your policies out of the fear of Russians not attacking you, they will attack you. And this is exactly where you need Georgia. You said it several times that I understand if you're from Georgia, you're desperate to become a member of NATO. You should be more desperate to get us in NATO than Georgia is. You need Georgia even more than we need NATO membership in NATO today. Why? Because Georgia is an opportunity for you to prove to Russians that they do not have a veto power. They do not guide your policies. They do not make decisions instead of you. Because everybody knows in this room, outside this room, that the only reason Georgia is not a member so far is because Russia does not want so. And it's not because some public opinion in France is not supporting it, but it is because Russia does not want so. And you obey to Russia's decision on that. This is why you need Georgia today more, to see it as an opportunity, to prove it there. And there is no country, as it was already said, whatever Russia's opinion was about their membership, being it Baltics or Czech Republic or any other for that matter, where Russia started the war because of their membership. And they're not going to start the war in Montenegro either. And they did not do it in Albania, because this is exactly where the NATO's peace power is. And there was no single war between the two after the Second World War, exactly because of this notion that of one free and in peace, which works. It works. And we Georgians see membership to NATO as to fight somebody, but as to stop fighting with anybody and to get on our both feet and be as strong as any other normal nation would have wanted to be without the war, in peace. And if there is anybody in this room who seriously believes that the reason there is no war in Baltics is because somebody in Kremlin just decided to give up on Baltics by itself, and not because Baltics are members of NATO and European Union, I'm sorry, but you got it totally wrong about Russia. So just to finish there, one more thing which is, I think, important. Today, there was 10-hectare more land grabbed by Russia in South Ossetia. 3 weeks ago, a serviceman just walked out of the administrative boundary line with Abkhazia, shot a Georgian 30-year-old guy on the other side of this boundary line, and went back without any troubles. And it is happening every day. We had the President Tusk in Georgia, and exactly for the 28 minutes he had a press conference with our president, there was a Russian military helicopter flying on the city of Gori for exactly those 28 minutes. This is Russia. So now, this is the cynicism of Russia. I have two questions to that. First, with membership or without membership, with map or without map, whatever decisions world powers are planning to make about Georgia and Warsaw. Where is the red line? That's the main question I have. What is the red line for you, partners of Georgia, partners of a country who is, again, I'm going to repeat it, the largest per capita troops contributor in Afghanistan, who's been called every time security was calling for the contribution of armed forces in different parts of the world. I had this morning Skype call of 3 continents. I had talked with the team in South Central Africa. I was sitting here, and my team in Tbilisi talking about some issues that are emerging in Central African Republic with our troops. What is it you are going to do about the country, Georgia? What is your red line? Where do you see the end of it? What is it, the momentum when you say, okay, that's enough. After that, we are not going to tolerate this? Because I remind you, they are standing just like, I don't know, 1 kilometer away from the main highway. The main highway, which is ensuring diversity of energy security for Europe. The main highway, where all those pipelines, gas pipelines, oil pipelines flow. The highway we call the highway of freedom, by which you can create alternative, including from China, from Caspian resources for Europe. Where is the red line? Today, without the membership, just having Georgia as loyal strategic partner as you have, and it is accepted. So we don't argue about it. So far, on paper, we are strategic, most reliable, most loyal partner to NATO and all those Western European powers. So my question is, what are you going to do about this strategic, most loyal partner tomorrow if Russia decides to blow up those pipelines that are so important to Europe? It's not that simple, as we are trying to put here, that, oh, yeah, you are Georgia Minister of Defense, of course you care about the security of your country. Security of my country is very much fundamental issue for the security of Europe. And I can go even further. There is no secure Europe. There is no free Europe. There is no Europe in peace without Georgia being in peace and being part of that security architecture. That's the matter of the reality today. This is the world we live in. It might be different tomorrow. It was completely different with the Soviet Union. But I have bad news. There is no Soviet Union anymore. And Georgia has made its choice. And we are going to keep knocking on that door, whether anybody likes it or not. And you are going to open that door for us eventually, one day. But before that, we all need to think about those red lines. What are the red lines?
I think, Tinatin has in a very emotional way sort of summed up, the extremely risky and situation in which we are, and also the fundamental question that we have to address, because indeed, what is being played out in the question we have to answer about Georgia and Ukraine is actually also a question about our own security, and we've known that the history of Russia has been to define the legitimate security interest in very different ways. I mean, it's evolving. So one day it will be that, and the next day it will be, they will push further if we don't actually put this thing in check. And but how to do it, I think apparently there's a huge disagreement between many people, but I would like to open the questions for the audience. Please, sir. Very short questions because I have very little time.
I know. I'd just like to remind the minister from Georgia that Jack Kennedy famously said the only thing worse than being an enemy of the United States is being a friend. And I'm afraid that applies today. My question is for Steve. How do you get a Republican Senate to approve Montenegro when your leading candidate and presidential contender says NATO is obsolete and under no circumstances would ever go to war over Montenegro? How does the Senate vote yes?
Mm-hmm. So I have to say that I'm a little bit outside the Senate debate, although I'm certainly following American politics with as much fascination as horror as anybody in this room. I think you have to make the case. Montenegro's ready. They'll be a net contributor to the security and peace of Europe, that they're willing to meet their alliance commitments, that they've taken the steps necessary to qualify for membership. And I think you argue the case on its merits. Article 5 is conflated in many ways, and obviously it's the terminal state of the NATO commitment. But Article 5 in and of itself doesn't automatically oblige any country to go to the defense of any other country. It considers an attack to be an attack on all, and it calls for collective defense, and it asks each country to evaluate the manner in which it considers it appropriate to respond to that. Now, we popularly construe that as us immediately going to the defense of other countries, but it's a little bit more subtle and complicated than simply have troops poised ready to go into Montenegro on day one. I think the goal is to erase a security vacuum, to begin filling in the part of Europe that the former Yugoslavia occupied, and bringing these countries fully into the European institutions, not on the basis of because you're going to defend them under Article 5, but on the basis of because in doing so, you significantly diminish the likelihood that you will ever be required to mount a military defense of those countries. And I don't think there's any objective analysis that would suggest that Montenegro is more dangerous to us inside the NATO alliance than it is outside the NATO alliance.
There was a question here.
Just to continue that, I'm going to be talking on Montenegro, but there is a huge investment in the last 15 years that the United States and the West has done in the Balkans to just let it there and not think that the integration in EU and NATO will not protect that investment, and even more not go back to where it was 15 years ago. But my question to the professor is, it's kind of a surprise to me that you say that it was unpredictable when you had the behavior in Chechnya, Dagestan, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Ukraine. So the surprise doesn't stay there. My question is, weaponizing refugees to destabilize Western Balkans and European Union now, isn't it that a signal and an indicator of where this is going in terms of national security and interest of United States too? Does it have to happen to Pearl Harbor for you to understand that actually things can go so wrong and so far that you will have to be strategic in the way the world peace should be maintained?
Just a couple quick points. One is, the fact is that the West, and especially the United States, were completely surprised by what happened on February 22nd, 2014, and in the subsequent 2 months. The newspapers were filled with stories. We were just caught with our pants down. Second point I would make, with regard to refugees in Europe, that's a gift to Europe from the United States. You understand, we have principally created that crisis by all the murder and mayhem that we've promoted in the Middle East. Had the United States not toppled Saddam Hussein, tried to lead the charge against Assad in Syria, and so forth and so on, you know what happened in Libya, you wouldn't have this refugee problem. So it's a gift of the United States. How is the United States going to deal with this? There's no real military solution to this, right? It's not like the United States is going to recommit itself to NATO because of the refugee crisis. And indeed, really what's going on here, we haven't talked about this at all, but it's of enormous importance for people at the Atlantic Council, is the rise of China. The United States is confronting a potential peer competitor down the road, and the idea that we're going to have a pivot to Asia is almost for certain. And if you pivot to some place, you pivot away from another place. And the place we're going to pivot away from is not the Middle East, the third area that we care greatly about. The area we're going to pivot away from is Europe. And the reason we're going to pivot away from Europe, we've not talked much about this either, is because Russia is a declining great power. That's another reason we shouldn't care and don't care that much about Russia, because it's a declining great power. The exact opposite is true with China. And the United States is going to have its hands full dealing with the Chinese. And oh, by the way, in an ideal world, you want the Russians on your side as part of the balancing coalition against the Chinese. So don't be surprised if over time the United States gets closer to the Russians, because we need them against the Chinese.
Yeah, but we've been trying to get close to them for quite a while. It didn't work very well, and it didn't. Well, I mean, Mr. Trump is going to change everything, or I mean, George W. Bush really tried, and Obama tried. Nobody really succeeded. I think I'm going to close the session. I'm afraid maybe a last question. over there, and we have to close this fascinating conversation.
Good afternoon, Harold Cohen, Atlantic Council. I just came back from Russia, and I can tell the audience and the esteemed professor that Russia is in a funk of anti-American rhetoric and public opinion mobilization not seen during the tail end of the Cold War, and I'm old enough to remember that. And I would also add that I speak native Russian and I can read and talk to the people in Moscow. And it's not about what America does or doesn't do. It's about the survival of the Russian regime, because the regime lost its legitimacy. It bought it with the Crimea for about 2 years. And what the Russians call the competition between the fridge and the TV set, in the end of the day, doesn't matter how much the anti-American rhetoric is going to be spewed on Russian television. It's the refrigerator, the empty refrigerator, is going to lose. So it's not about American foreign policy. It is about an authoritarian regime that is losing its legitimacy. Thank you very much.
I think it's a good conclusion to this, which, yes, it's a good conclusion which brings us back actually to the question of what drives Russian foreign policy. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to invite everyone to join us for lunch just outside. We're just a few minutes behind schedule, so please grab your lunch, find a place, you can come back in, and we will start back here a few minutes after 2. Thank you so much.